Welcome to Oldspeak with Luke Isaac. Today I'm with Peter Chandler from the Northern Territory. Now, many of you who are Mexicans, like we are considered, outside of the Territory, know maybe just a little bit of the bad news that we saw coming through from Pete's time in government up there. It was an absolute shambles, wasn't it, Pete? Towards the end?
Look, I think on the surface we were an ugly mess. Sadly, behind the scenes, much of what we were doing, which was good work, was masked terribly by what I would consider a very biased media. Mm-hmm. However, at the same time, I've got to acknowledge that we were certainly feeding them enough rubbish for them to print. Sadly, all of the shenanigans at the top level just undermined all the good work that was going on behind the scenes. So at the surface, we were a mess.
So Peter served at the CLP for 8 years in government. He held so many portfolios. Would you say you were in charge of approximately 2/3 of the Territory's budget at the time? Your Wikipedia entry here is quite vast for a Territorian politician. A Minister for Business, Trade, Economic Development, Employment and Training, Housing, Lands Planning, Police, Fire and Emergency, Transport, Veteran Support, Essential Services, Infrastructure, and it goes on. And you were also the Deputy Chief for a time as well. We've got Pete on today. As all of you in Queensland, my current state, knows, we're heading for an election on Saturday. Pete, this is an absolute shambles at the moment. The Turnbull government has abandoned its conservative base, and people are looking to vote pretty well anywhere else at the moment. We've got the Bennelong by-election coming up, which is going to be seen as what would you say?
A real test.
Yes, a real test match for the rest of Australia. We've got Keneally and Alexander. John Alexander there has dropped 9.7 points in the last couple of weeks. So basically they're 50-50, neck and neck at the moment, and it could go either way. We've got the New England by-election coming up just before that one. And some of the pundits that I'm speaking to were saying we could expect a federal between 12 and 15 weeks after that.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. The sad thing in all of this, and this is reflective of politics today in Australia, is that the media has so much control with perception. Perception becomes people's reality. And if people read, first up, what they see in the newspapers, listen to the radio or see on the news, and take 100% verbatim what they are saying is true, is gospel, then we're in real trouble, because we all know that journalists from time to time, and don't get me wrong, I'm using a pretty broad brush here because there are some good ones out there, but many journalists, I think, border on the fact that they are commentators and not journalists. I've got a lot of time for people like Paul Murray and Bolt, who will come out and say that they are commentators. They're not journalists, they are commentators.
Yeah.
So they're allowed to express an opinion. But so when someone watches the news at night time on television, or they listen to the radio, or that they read in the newspaper an article written by a journalist, they expect that what is in there is as close to the truth as is possible. But the journalist has done real research, and sadly today, unfortunately, you know what, the media is more interested in silly stories than it is about building new schools, bridges and roads to help our economy.
Absolutely. And this, look, for two things. One, the whole reason for a show like this is because many of us observers, journalists, let's just call it that. We've seen a huge gulf between journalism and media just open up in the past 15, 20 years, and it's just got worse and worse and worse. Real journalism is holding power to account. It's the fourth estate. This horrible beast that we have in Australia, it's not just Australia, but across the Western world of mainstream media. You've seen those videos where you basically have exactly the same statement and story repeated on 56 news channels at the same time. Agendas and multi-billion-dollar agendas are being driven from the media to make policy. And we saw that with the same-sex marriage plebiscite, with the No campaign being outspent ridiculously. And it's really hard. It's really hard for people who, like us, who like to go a little bit deeper and find out, what are the real machinations, what are the real flow-on effects going to be from making such a huge decision to the substructure of our Western civilization. Most people are so used to slogans, and the media is very good at those. And look,
and to be honest, you and many of my friends are very engaged in the political spectrum that it is. Sadly, many Australians are not engaged in the political spectrum at all, don't care, not interested, and therefore when it comes time to voting, they are looking at a voting card and it's the first time they've engaged in what they're doing on the day that they're voting. So everything in the lead up to an election, everything that happens from election to election, for many people is just rhetoric. And in fact, any time a politician's on the news, it's just white noise. They're not interested, they're not engaged. Sadly, people like that always, or quite likely, will fall or be attracted to the shiny baubles that are thrown up before an election. And there's one thing
we
that
saw it with Julia Gillard, and where her numbers were slipping, and all of a sudden this national broadband network, this bauble.
And the sad thing, and this is true, the sad thing is that too many people in Australia are complacent when it comes to politics. And therefore, because of their disinterest, Labor and the left side of politics are extremely good. They are talented in this space, and that is to find what baubles to present, what shiny objects for people to look at. And I know this sounds simplistic, but they are the slogan masters. They are, if you like, the short-term policy masters to grab someone's attention very quickly, win the election, and then stuff the bloody country. And I ask people, before you put an X or a tick in a box, whatever you do in Queensland, before you do, have a look at the history of governments in this country and have a look at what governments have provided prosperity, what governments have really focused on building an economy, and have a look at what governments that have just spent money and put Australia further into debt. And I ask you to judge people on their past, not on what they're telling you that they're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is one thing, though, that I think this, say, same-sex marriage plebiscite, for example, engaged with people. 40% of the population is not something to be sneezed at. This was something that a lot of the observers have said it would have been 10 to 15% voting no if it hadn't have been for a fairly well-run campaign by the Coalition for Marriage and others, exposing them to the rest of the world, weaponised human rights commissions, the implications of changing the definition of biological to legal parent, families and businesses who have suffered because of this agenda running awry. And so, attacks on free speech. So I think one of the things that has been very interesting about the last 90 days has been Australians generally have become more engaged with the issues. That hashtag love is love, that it was some unidimensional decision they were asking to make on that ABS ballot paper wasn't so. So I think Australians are going to be looking into the near future very keenly on what happens next, because we were warned that a weaponised human rights commission could be in the near future, that businesses could suffer, that children's rights could suffer, that this horrible Safe Schools program, which we'll talk about in a moment, would be forced on every child. I think Australians are going to be watching more keenly now than they would have been 3 months ago.
Yeah. Look, Luke, I think what I've seen recently, either camp cannot be proud of some of the actions that took place in the lead up to the same-sex marriage vote that went out there. The truth is there was a lot of good, there was a lot of bad on both sides. I don't think either side can be proud. But I think that the process that government took created or opened up a very, if you like, a wound that is that is turned Australian against Australian.
Yes.
It's been very, very divisive. I mean, even down to the family. You know, we had many discussions in this household around, which way were people going to vote. And some of these, I won't say they were heated arguments, but they were very robust, very robust. And at the end of the day, I was saying to some people, what are you voting for? You're certainly not voting for legislation because you haven't seen the legislation.
That's right.
How do you know what's in the legislation?
Yes.
What's going to be covered? If it was a simple question, I think, probably, as it was the case, the majority of Australians would have said yes. Mm-hmm. But there are those people out there that are rightly sceptical because of a lot of reasons. One, we don't know what the legislation entails. Secondly, what is to come? And these are the things that no side could really answer. That's yes, right. On the left you had there's nothing to fear. On the right side, you had views that there was a lot to fear. But I think that in itself demonstrated quite clearly no one really knows. But it was a very divisive issue from on public forums like Facebook and Twitter and others, right down to the family, where mums and dads and their children are sitting down having arguments in some cases or robust debates that, some people would see that as healthy, others would see it as very divisive.
Well, I think a lot of attitudes rose to the surface over this particular postal survey that we haven't seen since the 70s and 80s in this country. And it was horrible. It was horrible to see because the thing that got me onto it, as a libertarian, as you know...
I would never have known.
I didn't have a dog in the fight until... I thought if we live in a secular democracy and people want to vote this way, fine. But it took 36 gay friends of mine and commentators from around the world and a couple of gay no campaigners from Ireland that said, no, you need to take this thing a lot more seriously. This isn't just about, in terms of civil rights, you have everything at your disposal. It wasn't Tanya Plibersek's 2015 speech all about that there is now no discrimination between same-sex couples and under law, except for a few minor things in state law, and straight couples. They weren't, but for me, I didn't care until I started looking at the fact that A, there was no legislation, B, 24 countries that have done this before have very, very big problems when it comes to a 1,200-year battle to the right to free speech, right? Being eradicated in one vote. And certain things being taught to their children that they're not comfortable with, on and on and on. When I realised that over 36 of my gay friends were voting no, I thought, what's going on here? Who are these people leading the charge? Most of them, these people were not representing, this LGBTIQ plus collective were not representing my gay friends in the music industry and beyond. So what was this really about? As we dug deeper, I spoke to women like Sharon Slater at Family Watch International. You talk UNESCO, UNFPA. She fights this CSE agenda at the UN level. We've found that this anti-bullying program that we have in Australia called Safe Schools is virtually identical to the gender theory being pushed en masse at the same time all over the world. These were the same people. These were the same people who were leading the charge for this same-sex marriage plebiscite. Talk to me about your experience with safe schools in Northern Territory.
Okay, well, as a former education minister, I was, if you like, in the first instance, sold a package that this was all about anti-bullying. Who's not going to support that? Who's not going to support that? I'm dead against bullying in schools and anything we can do to rectify, to help, to provide the tools that teachers and others working within education can use to help with bullying, all for it. However, then I started to uncover a few issues. They were things like the threads that the website had to other areas. And I think, to be honest, touching on subjects that were well outside, if you like, the year groups that they were targeted at. These kids were too immature to be dealing with some of these issues. The fact that we've got Victoria at the moment where this is forced down people's throats, I think is totally wrong. What I actually did in the Northern Territory is that I said that, and I'll tell you why first. I think I was losing the argument in the media. Not hard to understand why. However, what I end up saying is that if schools in the Northern Territory were going to want to use the Safe Schools program, it would be up to individual school councils to look at the material and to decide for themselves whether it's something that they wanted in their schools. And I can tell you the absolute majority, in fact, I can't think of any school council, council chair or councillor that I spoke to during my tenure as Education Minister was supportive of the Safe Schools model when they learnt a little bit more about it. Yes, they all agreed we should do what we can against bullying in schools, but when they seen what the, if you like, let's call it the hidden agenda with that whole program, that's where people drew the line and said no. But as I said, I didn't want to make the political statement that we were going to stop it completely. What I wanted to do was give responsibility back to councils, school councils, to make a determination whether or not they wanted it in their schools. And in my time, not one school approached me saying, yes, they wanted it in their schools.
Absolutely, and these are the people who actually had access to the material. We've seen women like Marika Ranci and political posting Mama and others come out since, after speaking to her children about and after iPhone recordings of the safe space curriculum have actually leaked out about what's actually being taught to children. That and the parents actually started finding out about this. It's such an insidious program. Because it doesn't just exist in sex ed, it exists across humanities studies, your gender studies, your sciences and everything. It's interwoven amongst a whole slew of disciplines. And as parents are finding out about what their children are being taught, they're becoming ropeable across the country. And
it was a Trojan horse, without doubt, an absolute modern Trojan horse.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, Victoria is by far leading the charge on this program. They're leading the charge on a few other things at the moment. We've just had this assisted dying bill, this euthanasia bill, pass the upper house today. They said with a few amendments. I haven't seen the amendments yet. Now, you were the first territory in the country to have actually had a euthanasia bill pass and then get struck down. Can you talk about your experience and why it was struck down at the federal level?
Well, I think there was a lot of misinformation around at the time, and I think it was pretty bold legislation. The Chief Minister at the time, and I think the government at the time, should have been congratulated for taking on something so bold. Having said that, it really cuts deeply with Territorians that their government, the government they elect, only is in place because of an act of federal parliament.
Yes.
And the fact, it's the same. And Canberra and the Northern Territory, in fact, I believe also this happens on Norfolk Island. But we're the only jurisdictions in the country that a federal government can overturn our laws.
Yes.
This can't happen in New South Wales. It certainly can't happen in Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, any state. You cannot have the federal government come in, unless it's a national emergency or something like that. They cannot come in and overturn your legislation. So this was legislation introduced by a legal representative of the people, duly elected. They made legislation. It was highly supported here in the Northern Territory. It passed, but it was overturned, and strangely enough, by a Conservative or Liberal government, which that really hurt, because at the time you had the CLP government in the Northern Territory, a liberal government, a country Liberal government, and at the same time you had a Liberal government or a coalition government in Canberra who overturned the legislation. And Mr. Andrews, I don't think will ever be forgiven for what he's done. And you know what? There are people out there, whether they support the euthanasia bill or not, are still angry because that someone stepped in and overturned legislation. So it went beyond. It went beyond what people's thoughts were, their personal views about the right to die legislation. It was the fact that Territorians were considered second-class citizens and that they couldn't make decisions for themselves.
Well, there's already discussion about this precedent now being discussed in New South Wales, South Australia, and Queensland. And now we were blessed to have. So Victoria has the world's worst abortion laws. To anybody who doesn't like abortion, like myself, they have the world's worst, and it's being replicated in other places around the world. But Queensland just struck that down. Okay, basically a cookie crunched version of what's happening in Victoria very recently. I don't know that a euthanasia bill would get across the line here very soon. But again, once you set a precedent, the other states want to say me too. What can we do at a local level? Okay, so when you are out there, you're drumming up support. I've spoken to journalists in the Northern Territory at NT News, and they hated towards the end the CLP government. But every one of them had good things to say about you. And so it was very surprising to a lot of people that when you basically got voted out as well. Even the leftist newspaper and the leftist journalists up there had a lot of respect for your work, and I guess the fact that you were fair dinkum about your job, it reflected to the public. Given your time again, what would you be doing right now to encourage other people to get out there and be involved? Well,
there's no short answer to this, but if we stay in the context of Queensland,
yep.
I felt sorry in some regard for Campbell Newman, because he took on an extremely difficult job, and he did exactly what Terry Mills tried to do here in the Northern Territory, and ultimately it was Terry that was booted out by, in fact, the elected members at the time. Tried to do things too quickly. The enormity of the challenge is that you first need to win government. So therefore, even the Libs, the LNP, need to come up with some shiny baubles, because without them, if you were going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, no one's ever going to vote for you. Because you know what? What you're going to say to people is, you know what? I can't promise anything until I get on the Treasury benches. I need to look at the books. I need to actually look at how the departments are working. I need to change cultures within departments. Mm-hmm. We've got to turn these into business entities with a business focus on representing the community. Not just be public servants. We are there to represent the community. Mm-hmm. We should be looking at smaller governments and governments that can support the business world. It is the business world that grows the economy in this country, in fact, all around the world. It's not governments. And yet the leftists will always want a big government and think that government should be responsible for everything. But if you were to go to an election and say, you know what, sorry guys, you know what, I don't want to lie to you, so therefore I'm not going to promise you anything, but elect me and I'll do the bloody best job that I can, there'll be some people out there think, you know, I like this guy, I'm going to vote him. But there'll be so many more out there that'll go, oh, look at the shiny bauble over there, and I'm voting for that, because it might promise something where there's no guarantee it's ever going to be delivered. And this is what I say again. Look at previous Labor governments, whether at the state level or at the federal level, on what they've done to debt in this country.
Yes.
What they've done to so many of our rules and regulations around the country. They've just built layer upon layer upon layer of bureaucracy, which ultimately needs more and more public servants. Because the moment you add another layer of bureaucracy, you need someone to be able to manage it. And that's just more and more public servants. What I'm saying, we need to have the focus on the business world, and government should be there to focus on the business world, but at the same time have the correct regulatory frameworks in place to ensure the business world is operating safely and within the realms of what's right for the community. So it is a balance, but the Conservatives will always, and the Liberals will always have that view of the world.
Yes.
Labor has a different view. So for Queensland, as happened in the Northern Territory, I think Newman went too fast too soon.
Yes.
Terry did the same thing up here, too fast too soon. Mm-hmm. In hindsight, if they could have went back to the general public and said, guys, we promised this prior to the election, the job is of such a magnitude that if we were to deliver on our promises, you as Queenslanders or us as Territorians would hurt too much to achieve the goals of getting the fiscal balance back in order, to pay down the debt. If we were to try to do that all in one term, sorry, you're going to kick us out at the next election because there'll be too much pain to bear. Yeah. It happened in Queensland. It happened here in the Northern Territory. We tried to do too much too soon. Mm-hmm. And yet, you know, for people in Queensland, when the country Liberals entered government, we inherited a projected debt of $5.5 billion. In 4 years, we'd cut that to $2.4 billion.
Wow.
That's about $100 million every year in interest payments alone.
Yeah.
But when you talk to the average person on the street, what does that mean? What it means to me is another school or two schools or roads and bridges that we're not just paying to banks.
Yeah.
Government's paying taxpayers' money to banks. Mm-hmm. But to the average person, unless it affects them personally, how do you sell that economic message? And the Liberals, the National Party, the LNP will always focus on, if you like, economy. Mm-hmm. They'll always focus on fiscal responsibility. Mm-hmm. But to the average punter, maybe if I'm going to give you another $100 in the bank because, you know what, we're going to change something over here or give you a shiny new bauble, you'll do me, I'll vote for you. And ultimately, they'll be let down because Labor governments historically let people down in the country, but they're forgiven at the next election.
Yeah.
And I would ask people in Queensland to think of what Newman was able to achieve in a very short period of time. I think your current Premier took government last time around not prepared. I mean, I still have visions of her with a camera on her when she knew for the first time that she was going to be Premier of Queensland. It was dumbstruck.
Yeah.
Absolutely dumbstruck. And, you know, I think in the last...
improved. I saw her, the opening for the campaign recently, just a little press clipping, and she couldn't speak. At all. And I'm thinking, how are you making deals? Like, how are you... Yeah, and it's amazing. And you're right. I do think nationally people... we've got a hunting season ahead of us, right? From the by-elections, this constitutional clean... the citizenship debacle that's happening all over, the same-sex marriage plebiscite. I think by the end of it, people are going to be exhausted. What we come out with could be chaotic or it could be good.
One of the major problems, Luke, that governments around Australia, in fact, around the world that are bound to the Westminster system. You know, probably the best we've got. Mm-hmm. However, you know, unlike the Chinese that have 100-year plans or 1,000-year plans, you know, we have 3 or 4 year plans depending on what the jurisdiction. And whenever you've got that short-term planning, you can never ever have a long-term goal in mind. I know and I'll touch on education again. When I had an interest, a real interest in Indigenous education in the Territory. Mm-hmm. When I undertook a review of Indigenous education, I worked really closely with Noel Pearson in North Queensland. And when I seen what direct instruction was doing for those children up there, I just thought for a moment, what if we were to duplicate that in the Territory? Make it fit for purpose for our way that we do things in the Territory. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but is it going to be a method that's going to start to improve education, therefore opportunities for Indigenous people, particularly those in remote locations? But at the end of it, I ultimately said that we needed to commit to this long term. My advice, even advice from my own departments, was that, Minister, why don't you look at this as a pilot program? And I said, no one invests in a pilot program. There are pilot programs running all across this country. Government upon government have pilot programs. Yeah. If you want teachers to invest in this, if you want communities to invest in a program, you've got to have a long plan. So when I went back to Parliament, if you like, to sell my report, to sell the vision on this, it was that I needed to have, at that stage, the Labor opposition, I needed their support for a 10-year plan. That if we were going to do this, we had to commit to it for at least 10 years so that everyone that gives it the time of day would invest their heart and soul into it. And you know what? Those schools that have invested in direct instruction, they are making real changes. And I've had teachers come to me who were the chain rattlers and the ones out there with the unions before saying, oh, you know, Chandler's stuffed up again. You know, where's he going with this? Those same teachers come back to me and say, Mr. Chandler, I apologise for my actions earlier. I work in these schools today and I'm seeing a real difference. These kids are engaged. It's working for them. Now, when you've got teachers that come to you and tell you that, who were dead against this program in the first instance, and now fully supportive of it, I think, you know what, if the teachers are on side, if the system's showing results, then it's something you should support. And the reason behind it, why are these teachers all of a sudden coming on side? they see the results.
Yeah.
They're seeing improvement in these kids.
Yeah.
And ultimately, one of the reasons behind introducing a system, under the support of Noel Pearson, was that if kids were engaged in school, they're more likely to turn up to school.
Absolutely.
And look, some places in Queensland, and particularly here in the Northern Territory, we've got some of the poorest attendance rates right across Australia. But if we can find a reason for kids to come to school, if they can feel engaged and part of a system, rather than sitting there looking out the windows and otherwise engaged in stirring up the kid next to them because they've got not a clue what's going on in front of them, if we found a program where they can work, where they can see that they are actually learning and therefore becoming engaged into a system, guess what? They're more likely to turn up to school.
Absolutely.
And so that is one of the major issues that we've got with the Westminster system and the short-term election cycles that we have in this country, particularly at the federal level. 3 years, forget it. Why this country doesn't have 4, at least 5-year terms is beyond me. And I know that people out there will go, no, if you've got a bad government, we need the ability to be able to kick them out.
Queensland does. We're good.
What do you have, 4 years?
Yeah, now, yes.
And so do we in the Territory. Yeah. But at the federal level, they should be at least 4 or 5 years to give.
That's right.
Give, if you like, the opportunity to set some longer-term plans rather than these damn short-term plans that ultimately lead nowhere.
And probably in the case of your education program, I can just imagine, I believe that was closer to the end of your tenure. Labor would probably be taking credit for all of the work, you know what, Luke, I don't really care. I know you don't. I know you don't.
If the kids are getting a better education today than what they were yesterday, fantastic. That's all I want.
All right, let's bring this full circle. We've got Cory Bernardi, who's actually left the Liberal Party, and he is currently standing with AC. He's got an ungodly amount of members in such a short period of time since February, and I think people are seeing the writing on the wall. If the traditionally conservative government, at least in my lifetime, doesn't get its act together, we're likely to see One Nation crew potentially become kingmakers somewhere like Queensland, and groups like Australian Conservatives, which I think are founded on principles first, really enter the fray in the near term. How do you feel about that? I mean, it's been a two-party system for a long time. I think regardless of long-time Labor voters or long-time Liberal voters are switching, like lifelong Labor voters and lifelong Liberal voters are changing their colours now because they are so disillusioned with the fact that their party no longer represents them.
Luke, people are screaming out for change.
Yeah.
They're fed up with politicians who are bled lines from their media advisors. Some of them younger than you, and you're pretty young. Well, you're certainly younger than I am. But the truth is that people are sick of spin, and that's traditionally all you get through both sides of politics. So I'm not just pointing to one side here in particular. It's both sides.
Labor have just been better at it. It's that's all.
But Luke, so what that gets down to is that people they're fed up with the current parties. Therefore, they are screaming out for someone. Please stand up. Please stand up and do something different. And that's why people are pouring their hearts out to people like Cory and even things like One Nation. Now, look, there are certain things within One Nation where I think they've got certain policies that I would support.
Absolutely.
However, it is a radical bunch of people strung together, I think, through more disenchantment with the major parties than anything else. And Cory will have the same thing. He'll have people from both camps supporting him simply because they're fed up. What Australians desperately want is someone that has a vision for this country, but ultimately can sell that vision.
Yeah.
They've got to be able to sit down and talk one-on-one with people and, talk down the barrel of a camera and say, this is how good Australia is, but guess what? This is how much better it could be. And forget the spin. Just talk the truth, for God's sake.
Amen. And that's right. Just talk the truth. And we've seen it too much where men like Malcolm Turnbull can be forgiven in some respects for being not living in our world. if that makes sense. He's been a successful barrister. He's a very wealthy man. He doesn't necessarily relate. But the moment he chucked on that leather jacket, went on Q&A and starts playing the hashtag game on Twitter, hipsters flocked to him like it was going out of fashion. The numbers flew through the roof. What they didn't really probably take into account in the Liberal Party was the fact that hipsters are also mostly ADD, and they're going to forget about him just as quick as they wanted him on board. This is why we have these huge hashtag bring back Tony Abbott. You know, we have...
Oh, there's a bright light.
That's right.
There's a butterfly. Yeah. So look, I had a lot of confidence in, I suppose, in Malcolm Turnbull being able to unite, the Libs, the Nationals, and I saw Tony Abbott as a straight shooter, an absolute straight shooter. But like many of the politicians in the Northern Territory, one of my friends, Dave Tollner, the former treasurer, Dave was a shoot from the hip kind of guy, and he rubbed people up the wrong way. And I think Tony Abbott ultimately rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. And when I see Malcolm Turnbull come along, I thought, maybe, just maybe, he could be the one that could lead the charge and bring the team back together. Sadly, I just haven't seen that happen. Someone that had so much potential, I don't think has been able to do what I thought he was going to do.
Yeah, well, I think as people are suffering more, we talk about the red pill moments in people's lives, and it usually happens because of an adversity. Whether somebody's lost their job, they've come face to face with medical tyranny, they learn something about what their children are being taught, masturbation in school or something like that, as a 13-year-old child. That kind of adversity is usually what starts the red pill momentum in somebody's life. I think Australians are starting to feel that, not just economically, but at their core principles and their core values, and they're being forced to examine things that they haven't had to for the last 35 years. We've been sort of living in the lap of luxury. However, the left and, the Gary Dowsetts and the Roswards and the La Trobe University cultural Marxists have been on the march this whole time while we've been sleeping. And we're only seeing the fruits of this now. So the substructure of the country is shifting rapidly. And I think a lot of Australians would like to rewind. They'd like to breathe. They'd like to just stop the boat for a moment, if we can use a Liberal slogan. Regardless of how frustrated Australians are at the moment in the political system, I do think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us because of the amount of elections and plebiscites and by-elections so close together. I think it leaves one big question mark over all of our heads as to what's going to happen. So, yeah, look, really appreciate having you on. I'd really like to get you on to talk about a few other issues in the near future. We're going to the polls Saturday here in Queensland, and again, question mark. It's good to have somebody from outside of the state, from outside of the chaos that is a Queensland election, sort of talking about principle over policy, because most of us can't see the forest for the trees at the moment.
Well, look, as a closing word, I would say, when Newman took over, he had an enormous challenge to get right, to change Queensland, to get it back on track, if you like. Too much too soon. Obviously, he was sent a very, very strong message at the last election. Sadly, I think much of what they started was undermined by a new inexperienced Labor government coming into Queensland. I've asked Queenslanders to look at the momentum that was starting under Newman, and whether you liked him or not, forget about the man. Think about what action the government was taking for the state, and think about that for one moment and see, from an outsider looking in, what I would see is that Queensland was starting to get back on track. In fact, the only thing out of Queensland over the last few years that has been absolutely top-notch is your state of origin team.
You're probably right.
But having said that, I really think that the brakes were applied by your current government, and therefore Queensland has slowly slid backwards under their watch. And so make a very, very careful decision on Saturday. And I would say the same thing for Territorians, and hopefully there's a few Territorians watching this. Be very careful, because watch what's going on at the moment in the Territory. And as I said before, we got news here in the Territory that the projected debt had grown to 3.5 billion. Now, this government up here has only been in power for just over 12 months now. We left them with a projected debt of 2.4, down from 5.5. It is now back to 3.5 in just over 12 months. And yet the economy has stalled. The place is going backwards. The average block of land up here has dropped about $40,000 to $45,000 with the latest economic modelling that's been done. So the place is going backwards. People are leaving the territory, and yet the government has gone into debt even further. The same thing will happen to Queensland. We need smaller governments that focus on supporting businesses and supporting jobs and the economy. Mm-hmm. So for Queenslanders, make a very careful decision this week. Vote for someone that you know that's going to focus on making Queensland a better place. Good luck and God bless.
Thank you so much, Pete. Take care.